Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will start by saying some words about where we are now, then continuing elaborating around the issue of sustainability, then a few words about just energy transition, and then going on to focusing on the energy system flexibility before I finalize with some words around the fact that carbon management is urgently needed. I would like to share some of these main questions with you before I continue. What would be the lowest cost route to Paris? If we do not select the lowest cost route, who should pay for that? A second thought could be, are we aiming for the largest possible share of the world population having access to electricity? A third one would be, do we want the largest possible share of renewables? Why is that? And should that be as soon as possible? And a possible last one could be, should there be a largest possible focus on the consumer? And why is that? And at what cost for the society? Where are we now? This illustrates Paris and the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report on global warming, the 1.5 degree report is an important scientific background for my talk. Having that as an important basis, I would state that while we are waiting, CO2 is accumulating, big cuts are needed, and they are needed urgently. If we see this graph and having net zero by 2050, of course, obviously, we need deep reductions of CO2. And we even need to have removal of CO2. That is both stated in this report. And I believe it's important to take that strongly into consideration. What about sustainability? Well, sustainability are many things, but in this context, I would like to point to a few of them. The fact that resources in general are limited. Is it possible to use fossil resources in a sustainable way? And maybe asking the question, is it sustainable not to use fossil resources if that could be used in a sustainable way? And I would also like to point towards the fact about social fairness. So focusing on facts then, before feelings, I would like to draw your attention to my next slide. And that is around how to measure sustainability. And I would like to show in that context this technical report from the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. So the EU Taxonomy, it's actually a list of economic activities which are classified based on their contribution to the EU sustainability goals. And at the same time, do no significant harm criteria have been used to other environmental objectives. It will enable capital markets to identify sustainable investment opportunities. And just to mention before I continue, carbon capture and storage, CCS, qualifies as a taxonomy eligible sector. And it states if it enables that primary activity to operate in compliance with the threshold, for example, steel, cement, and electricity production. And this report also considers the importance of CCS to scale up hydrogen production and to decarbonize in general. This is an illustration of this. If you see sustainable investments in the middle and for investors, This taxonomy will help the investors to take greater consideration of the investors' sustainability preferences. And a healthy planet will be easier to ensure with less economic harm caused by increased weather-related damage, as examples. Getting on to my next point, which is related to the social fairness part of sustainability, and this is the issue of the so-called just transition. As a major part of the European Green Deal, the issue of just transition is important. It is important to make sure that, and I would like to quote the Just Transition Commission, the report from the Scottish Commission, where they say that the imperative of a just transition is that governments design policies in a way that ensures the benefits of climate change, actions that those are shared widely, while the costs do not unfairly burden those least able to pay, or whose livelihoods are directly or indirectly at risk as the economy shifts and changes. To the right, you see guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. This is by the International Labour Organization. In the discussion around whether not to use or use fossil fuels, these aspects are important. And I just mentioned the examples of Eastern Europe, how to deal with the transition from coal-based economies, and the same for the oil and gas industries. My main next point is related to the importance of having a future flexible energy system, for that system to be climate friendly and to be built for the future, so to say. This is an illustration showing different energy carriers, electricity, gases, heat, liquids and solids, as well as energy storage. It's easy to understand that this system is complex, and it's important to not look at one energy vector at a time, but to understand that this complexity is important, and that the flexibility, increased flexibility of this system will be really important. And one very important tool, I would say, to increase this flexibility is the technology that I like to call carbon management, or CCS. It's also mentioned as CCUS, where you consider using the CO2 not for permanent storage, but for other uses. Well, this technology could actually decarbonize major parts of the industry. For some part of the industry, it's the only option to decarbonize. It will also enable negative emissions, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, for example, through the biogenic part of waste to energy and biomass in general. It will also enable the hydrogen economy. I mean, you can take the methane, for example, and you have the carbon and you have the hydrogen splitted, and by that you actually do decarbonize. And that hydrogen can be used for several things, like heating and cooling. You can change from heating by natural gas, for example, over to hydrogen. You can decarbonize transport by using hydrogen, and you could also use it for energy storage. By that, CCS can decarbonize industry, enable negative emissions, and enable the hydrogen economy at the same time. Another way of putting this is shown in this picture. You see that using, for example, natural gas resources plus CCS, you can produce hydrogen for all these different sectors. Here is another illustration of the same fact, having different feedstocks, using CCS, and having this solving the decarbonizing problem of different sectors. The IPCC report states actually that limiting the energy sector emissions without CCS would increase the cost of climate mitigation by 138%. Another workplace it states, many models could not limit likely warming to below 2 degrees if bioenergy, CCS and their combination are limited. This slide is about the importance of selecting solutions based on your CO2 emissions reductions goal. I have one example here showing that if you aim for a certain reductions by 2050, this is UK, 60%, CCS is not considered to be part of the solution. It will be too costly for that goal. If the goal is 80% reduction, which is in this context needed to reaching the Paris Agreement, well, CCS is strongly needed. So what does this sum up to? Well, there are some dilemmas, and I would obviously state first the climate crisis. In addition, we need to secure energy supply, and I would also like to mention the importance of fuel poverty. Any continent would like to increase its financial competitiveness, but please let's focus on the difference between what is important now, in the transition period, and in the future. For energy, this is important. I will also mention the issue of job security and the issue of environmental concerns in general. And I would like to point to a few ones. One on the wind farms, and as an example, and wildfires as an example of natural storage of CO2, which is actually, it shows that how important it is to have permanent storage underground as an alternative to storing the carbon in trees, for example. And finally, the availability of resources. We do have fossil energy resources, and they could be used in a sustainable way. And then finally, I like to make the comments. Some people would like to only invest in 100% renewables. I would like to pose the question, why is that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the first question I would like to ask you, because you were saying that CCS, or CCUS as we call it as well, will be part of the solution. It's got a huge potential. And for the last 5 years, I've heard people talking about CCS as part of the future solution. And I'm just wondering, is this a mature technology now? I mean, do we really see results of all the research that we've done so far into this area?
Thank you for that question. Keep getting that question. It's a good one. There are many reasons for this, I would say, but of course the obvious lack of business models is an explanation. And as long as it's more or less free to vent the CO2 to the atmosphere, why spend a lot of investment money on it? But the question around research and maturity, it's definitely a mature technology in the sense that you have off-the-shelf technology, and at the same time, in order to make it economically viable, of course, you need to reduce costs and increase reliability and so forth. But the short answer is yes, it's doable and it's ready.
Yeah, and in the audience there are people who are, would really like to talk more about CCS, and actually we're coming back to her afterwards, but I'm going to ask one of her questions already. It's Franziska Holz. You're going to meet her later on. She's one of the experts today. I'm going to explain all about that in 2 minutes. But since she has a very popular question, I'm going to pop it to you right now. So if CCS is a promising solution, why have so few companies engaged in it yet? Could it be with what you were just saying about the market not being ready, or is it other things?
Yes, I mean, we should look at the drivers, what drives this, and one could just imagine what would have happened with the Energiewende in Germany if it were not for the extreme amount of public money put on the table to make it happen. So I think it's a little bit about looking into the realities, and I would say that the story about about PV. I would not be surprised if you see the same history for CCS actually. It was a lot about public money being put on the table. No one saw that the price reductions happening that fast. I don't see any reason why this should not happen for CCS.